welcome to Cover Story. Today we have with us a very special guest from the US. We have with us Mr. Rajiv Malhotra. He's an author, he's a public intellectual, and also he is someone who has a very interesting take on Hinduism and Dharma. Welcome to Cover Story. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Mr. Malhotra.
Thank you for having me.
And before we begin, I said in my introduction that you have a very interesting take on Hinduism, but today you've come to India at a time when there is a huge debate going on between Hinduism and Hindutva. And frankly, one is also being seen as sort of a bad word, where it's all about rituals, all about pressurizing a certain vote bank. How do you differentiate between the two?
Well, Sanatana Dharma has been reincarnated many times. We believe in the rebirth theory. So the Dharma has come at many times, many ages, in new forms. So the modern version was called Hinduism. And now in the last 2-3 generations, the Hindutva is another version. So I think this is a more recent reincarnation of Hinduism. Okay. But Hinduism is an old faith. Even older is the Sanatana Dharma. So this version of Hinduism has a very strong political dimension to it and a social dimension to it.
I spoke about rituals of Hindutva that we are seeing being associated more with Hindutva. Would you agree with that?
Well, Sanatana Dharma has the philosophical side, the spiritual side, the inner side. But if you look at Mahabharata, it's also very politically active. And rituals, the agamas are also ritualistic. So the ritual side has also been there for a very long time. The bhakti side has been there for a very long time. So the Sanatana Dharma caters to many kinds of personalities, and different people like different things. Some people like to just meditate and have a spiritual aspect. Others do karma yoga. Others go and perform rituals, and they go to yatras and pilgrim sites and all that. So all of that comprises the Sanatana Dharma.
Okay. But a little bit more on the political aspect of it,
Yes.
that what we are seeing being practiced today, with the BJP in power, we've seen a lot of people saying that this is, we have the RSS saying that Hindutva is actually a way of life and not what is being actually practiced in the political world.
So, you see, until the Dharma was challenged by outside religions for a long, long time, it was very relaxed. It was an open system. People would come, migrate, settle down. Some of the earliest Jewish communities, Syrian Christians, they all came and they lived here very happily. They were welcome. Only recently, in the last few centuries, the foreign-born religions became very assertive, started becoming very aggressive, started, in fact, attacking the Dharma. So the Dharma has to respond. So I think the Hindutva is a response to threats which are genuine threats, which have come from overseas. Now, it is one thing to say that somebody is a Christian. It's another thing to say that he reports to the Vatican for authority, for funding, for direction, for appointment of leaders. So when a foreign religion is controlling how it is being practiced in India, it's almost like an MNC's branch office. So some of the religions here are, Indianized, and they're just another faith. That's fine. I don't think that poses a threat. But some of the foreign-based religions are actually getting their orders and directions and pointing at a foreign nexus for ideas, ideologies, and legitimacy. And so they are serving as either you could call them a consulate of a foreign country, or you could consider them as a branch office of a foreign multinational. So if you have a McDonald's, it may have only 30-40 people, but you don't say this is a minority establishment, because even though there's 30-40 people, it is part of a very giant organization, multinational organization. Similarly, every bishop in India, all the bishops of the Catholic Church are appointed by the Vatican. They are not indigenous. And so to address these issues and very aggressive evangelism, foreign evangelism, and all kinds of attacks on Hinduism. I live in the US. I lived there for 47 years. And I see a worldwide campaign to discourage, to disparage us, to undermine us, which is a organized conspiracy. I've written a lot of books on that. So I think we need a political response also, which maybe was not required in earlier centuries. But today we need it.
Okay, by us, a little bit about your background also. You know, you gave up your, 20 companies that you were running in the private sector to start the Infinity Foundation and to also, talk about a certain way of life. Can you tell us what exactly is it that prompted you to take this?
So, I was raised in Delhi after St. Stephen's College, where I did my physics. I went to the US. And from 20, now 68, I've lived all these years in the United States.
All right.
I've had a corporate career in technology. I became a management consultant to some of the largest companies, and then I started my own ventures. And I had 20 companies. When I was in my early 40s, around 43, 44, I quit the whole thing, wound up, and decided that I should give back to society. Giving back is an old tradition in our culture, to give back into society. Rather than going on accumulating and building a dynasty and so forth, I decided to pack up and do this full time with my own money. That's how I started. So that's what I do. That's what the Infinity Foundation does. And basically its purpose is understanding India for the 21st century, keeping it with integrity with the past, so I'm not distorting the past, and yet presenting it in a very modern, current style. But predominantly I'm addressing the westernized people who have a very big interest in this subject. I'm not addressing the very traditional people because they have many other ways to understand.
Right.
So the westernized people, the westernized diaspora, the globalized Indian, and the westernized Indians living in India itself, which is a very large segment of that, they are confused, they are muddled up. They may say I'm a Hindu, but that means, Diwali crackers and some sweets and some symbolic things and saying namaste maybe and so on. But deep down they are confused. And they are particularly scared and embarrassed when it comes to representing themselves openly, publicly, and being able to defend and being able to reason Hinduism in a logical way, which is what the world needs today. So I'm working on all that because I have a scientific background by training, and I have a corporate background, so I can communicate, I can argue, I can negotiate. And having lived in the West, I'm not scared of them because I had thousands of white Americans working for me, people in Britain and other countries, so I can see them on par. I'm not in awe of them, which is a problem that a lot of our people have when they go overseas, that they cannot speak with confidence. So given those backgrounds, I decided I ought to get into this.
Okay. But there is also the reverse action by some people are embarrassed to say that I practice this religion or this is my faith because of the in-your-face Hinduism, Hindutva, whatever you want to call it, of theories like Sita is the test tube baby, of this is what we are also having to deal with. So either you are this way or that way. There's no middle ground.
So the exaggeration is also a problem. I face that a lot, and I consider that to be a very serious problem. Okay. And that's because the people are lazy to have checked their facts. They are not scientific enough to have really done rigorous research. And a very bombastic, arrogant, egotistical, kind of a just chauvinistic over display of Hinduism is counterproductive. We lose credibility when we do that. So I don't believe in nuclear bombs in the Mahabharata. I want them to show me a crater which is radioactive, if that were the case.
Right.
I don't believe in Pushpak Viman until somebody shows me a sample. Physical sample, but I believe in tremendous amount of Vedic science. There is a lot of mathematics, there's a lot of astronomy, there's a lot of chemistry, there's a lot of medicine. So there are scientific claims which I talk about and write about. My foundation researches that, but we check it out. And then once we can prove something, we can claim it. So for instance, the Delhi Iron Pillar proves a whole lot of, steel technology that India was ahead of other places, and the British also acknowledged that when they came here.
Right.
So these are examples of legitimate contributions of our civilization, but the ones we cannot actually establish with proof, I don't want to talk about it. And the people who talk about it actually are doing us a disservice because we get confused. Everything we are doing gets dismissed very easily because of a few people making those kind of claims.
That's good to hear that. You've also written a book, Breaking India, which you, I think, presented to the Prime Minister, if I'm not wrong. Can you tell us a bit about what that is about? So,
living in the US, I've been tracking how a whole lot of money goes to India under the name of aid and helping poor people and all that, but actually these NGOs are anti-India. They're subverting. Some are Christian, some are leftist, Maoist, Marxist type people. And then there are the Islamic ones and from China. So there's many kinds of, interventions in India to exploit caste divides, North-South Aryan-Dravidian divides, gender divides. So, and a lot of Indians have sold out into that. There's a whole ecosystem in India of activism, of people who claim to be sort of helping the Indian situation. Actually, they're working for Western or foreign nexuses and reporting to them, being trained by them. And so this book talks about what I call the new sepoys. They are the pada likha, educated, anglicized, westernized sepoys. They're really for another nexus, another organization and ideology, and they're here to fight on the behalf of those people. So this is the Breaking India scenario, and I feel
But what is your main worry, that these people will come because they're also giving education, they're giving, they're trying to help people with hospitals, with medical health, educational
Yes.
help. So are you worried about brainwashing a mindset? What is your...
Yes, I think they are deeply entrenched in our education system, and even the new government hasn't been able to do much. This kind of ideology, which I call Breaking India, is entrenched in our foreign service. I have had discussions with our young diplomats, and they're also confused about the unity of our country, about the philosophical unity, and they are entrenched in the IAS, they are entrenched in some of the courts, certainly in the media. There's a huge amount of media which is more Breaking India. Now, if you look at America, there is the American grand narrative. They call it American exceptionalism. You could be left-wing, right-wing, Republican, Democrat, but you believe in the American exceptionalism. Right. That's the name of their grand narrative. Every Chinese has got a clear understanding of the Chinese grand narrative, not just government, but also private sector. A regular student would know. Japan has a very good sense of their history and pride in it. France has, Britain has, Russia has, Arabs have.
So
India is the only major civilization whose intellectual elite, ruling elite, media elite, educated elite are very confused about, is there an Indian grand narrative, and if so, what is it? And it is fashionable to actually undermine the idea of a unified great India. So my next book is called The Indian Grand Narrative, to address this problem. The Breaking India told you the problem, and the Indian Grand Narrative tells you how we should proceed.
So basically, diversity which will guard against the divisive forces that you outlined in Breaking India.
That's correct.
That is what is going on.
That is correct. That is correct. You see, diversity is fantastic, but then it can be exploited and misused and turned into conflict, which is what the Breaking India forces are trying to do.
With this sense of nationalism, would it be espousing, say, one religion, you've spoken about diversity, but you've also spoken about various safeguards. Would these also apply to Hinduism?
Yes. So Hinduism is an open architecture. I call it an open architecture. It accommodates people of all faiths. But the person coming from anywhere, any Paigambar, any prophet, any history is most welcome within the Hindu space, but their loyalty should be to India, to this land, not to another land. They should not be reporting to some boss somewhere else who's giving them ideology or giving them funding. And they should be in mutual respect with other faiths. This is very important.
So if the boss is RSS, what happens?
So if the boss is RSS, depends on the RSS person.
Okay.
Now, I have gotten to know some very good top leaders in this visit. I got to know Mohan Bhagwat and many others. And I must say, I'm quite impressed. I must say that when you get to know them as individuals and hear it straight from them, the RSS, I feel, has been misrepresented in a very serious way, is my feeling. I myself, having been raised in a westernized way, didn't know too much about RSS except what they talk about it. And what they talk about it really characterize it as a very nasty, fascist, this kind of khaki short and aggressive and violent kind of group. When I meet them in person, it's not like that. My impression of them as individuals, and I'm talking about the senior people, and their way of thinking and what their goals are, is quite different. So I think RSS has not done a good job of representing itself, especially in the westernized space.
Which is the issue. It's in your grand narrative, you're saying there is space, say, for a Ram Mandir, but there is not space for a Karni Sena or a Gau Rakshak or these kind of elements.
I think that...
Would the RSS agree to that also?
Well, I think that one has to take each of those cases individually, but my feeling is that the true Sanatana Dharma welcomes diversity. And if somebody has a Quran Dharma, that is also possible as a dharma. And if somebody has a Bible dharma, that is also possible as a dharma. And if somebody has Jesus as his Ishta Devta, that's also fine. But the real test is, do you subscribe to mutual respect for others? And mutual respect is different than tolerance. Tolerance, I can tolerate you, but tolerance is insulting. I mean, imagine if I were to say, आपको हम tolerate कर रहे हैं, तो you will say, अरे, what's wrong with me? क्या tolerate करने की बात है? But I respect you. Respect means I actually consider, I honor you, I respect you, I celebrate celebrate who you are. But it has to be mutual. It cannot be unconditional respect, because if you offer unconditional respect, you also have to respect the Ravan, and you'll have to respect the Hitler and the Bin Laden. So it has to be mutual. If somebody from another faith is willing to respect my practice, I'm willing to respect their practice, there will be harmony. The problem comes when the certain faiths claim exclusivity, which means that only my way and nobody else is valid. And I have to either convert you one way or another. That's my agenda. So the conversion agenda should stop as part of mutual respect. Conversion agenda should stop. And loyalty to Bharat and its nation, its history, the heroes should be our heroes. The person of any faith from anywhere, nothing wrong in saying that the heroes are our people. Our people are the heroes. Why are foreign invaders the heroes? So, there's nothing in Islam, for example, that says you got to worship Aurangzeb. There's nothing that says you have to respect Aurangzeb. There is nothing in Islam that says you must always consider the Muslim invader valid and the Hindus who were invaded to be inferior. Nothing. Is it perfectly okay for a Muslim to say, I'm Indian, my ancestors were Indian, foreign invaders came, I happen to practice a certain faith which originated elsewhere, but I don't respect the violence that was created by certain people, even though they may have done it in the name of my religion. So it takes greatness to say that. It's like, as a Hindu, I do not respect the Hindus who are violent and doing wrong things. I don't have to go around saying every Hindu is a good Hindu. I don't have to say that.
Okay.
I mean, in our tradition...
It works both ways.
Yeah, in our tradition, if you look at Mahabharata, if you look at, all our texts, we are talking about good people and bad people. So what's wrong if in a particular civilization, in a particular tradition, you have both kinds of people? So I think that Indian first, open architecture and mutual respect is very critical. And as long as these caveats are met, people of all faiths are welcome.
That is your grand theory of nationalism.
That's my theory.
In this theory, what do you say about a party or an organization that doesn't give, say, tickets to anybody from the Muslim community, as is what happened?
I think it's a bad idea. I think we should any party should find people of all faiths, those who are on this platform of mutual respect, and Desh comes first. Desh Bhakti comes first. Our heroes are our own people. So people who subscribe to this, and I'm sure they'll find them. I mean, I'm not aligned with a party. I'm not a member of any party, by the way.
All right.
And I'm not a formal member of any organized religion either. I have my own faith, my own practice, but I'm a free-thinking intellectual. So I'm free to agree, disagree, criticize anybody. And what I'm representing are my views.
Okay, we've heard about your idea of India, but after the break, I'm going to be talking to you about India's place in the world.
Excellent.
So stay with us. We're going to be back after a short break. Hello and welcome back. We are in conversation with Mr. Rajiv Malhotra. He's an author, public intellectual and the thought leader. Mr. Malhotra, before the break we talked about the idea of India. Now let's go global. What is India's place in the world? How do we see India, especially with under this government?
So India's place should be, and India's place happens to be, I'll talk about both.
Done.
So India's place should be as a thought leader. At one time we were exporting knowledge from places like Nalanda, Takshashila. These were like the Harvards of today. People, the most learned people would come to get knowledge, and we were knowledge exporters. Today we are knowledge importers. We are importing the knowledge because we don't have good universities. Our HRD, I think, has failed. I really think that they have failed. So India should be a thought leader, a developer of spiritual ideas, healing. The Indian healing system has tremendous value, and the West is appropriating it, copying it, trademarking it, patenting it as their own, and making money out of it because we're not doing a sufficiently good job. So in India, in so many domains, in fashions, in creative works, in cuisine, as an exporter of culture, India has a lot to offer. And the world is looking for these kinds of things. Now, the current governments, I would say all the governments, I'm not picking on any particular one, have not done a good job of this. I find that the foreign diplomats do not understand, and this is old diplomats, new diplomats. I've presented at the Foreign Service Institute in Delhi multiple times. I don't think they're properly trained on the Indian civilization. I'm not happy and impressed by the Culture Ministry. I have not been impressed by the Ministry of External Affairs, the way they are projecting India's overseas. Maybe they know about India's nuclear policy and Kashmir policy and H-1B visa they're negotiating. These kind of very specific things. But India as a major figure, 1/6 of humanity, is not being given the proper space and the proper respect in the world. And I think a lot of it has to do with the way we are representing it, our government has been representing it. Now, to give you a good example, a month ago, I gave a huge talk about 2 months ago at the British Parliament. I was invited to the British Parliament. Government had nothing to do with it. There is a Nehru Center in London. They didn't help. They wanted me to come and address them.
Right.
It was a 100-minute, 1.5 hour long event with Q&A. It's on YouTube, and people should watch it. I gave very strong critiques of Britain, very strong critiques of Britain. And they applauded because I said it in a certain way. And I even made demands of what Britain should do to repair the harm it has done to India. So, for instance, I said in April 2019 will be the 100th anniversary of Jallianwala Bagh. We should get an apology. And later on they met me privately and said maybe we should organize some kind of a conference and maybe we should do that. Now, this is the job of Culture Minister.
Right.
But they're not doing it, and I'm doing it as a private citizen. And even when I've done it as a private citizen, they're not there helping me. I mean, they're just in their own world. I don't know what they're all about, but they're not doing this kind of a work, leading work. I want manuscripts back, which are in their possession. I want some artifacts back. But more than anything else, I want them to retract the Aryan-Dravidian divide, which Max Miller wrote and for the East India Company. And that has created a whole Dravidian movement in the South, separatist movement in the South. There was no such Aryan-Dravidian consciousness among our people until Max Miller did it for the East India Company. And today, the evidence is against it. So the British people said, yes, we should probably have a conference and we should have some kind of a resolution. They also created the modern caste system. There was caste, there was jati, but it wasn't a system so fixed as they made it. So if you look at what all the British did, a lot of that decolonization, they can help facilitate. And actually they're interested in doing that. Our people haven't gone and asked in the proper way.
So what is the solution then? Should our diplomats have a strong sense of, say, a cultural, historical perspective? Because all they're doing is moving files, as you say. They'll
have a dance here. They'll have some performance there.
So
idea is a one-off event here, there, and it's more like entertainment.
Correct.
Okay. Now you don't need the government to export Indian entertainment because Bollywood does that. These musicians go around the world. These famous musicians go around the world. The private money is enough. People buy tickets. They don't need government to patronize them because the free market of entertainment is very strong in India.
Right.
And Indian entertainment, Indian cuisine, all kinds of things are more than adequately represented in that sense. The idea that the government needs to do is a deep civilizational understanding of our past, understanding of our values. And you see, this is something that the Modi government has not done. They need an inter-ministry. They need kind of an understanding of our civilization that penetrates Culture Ministry, HRD Ministry, Ministry of External Affairs, Ministry of Home Affairs, all sorts of things. Both projecting positively and also protecting us from all the negative forces because there's a lot of disruption going on from these Breaking India forces and we are not monitoring them. I find the Indian government giving awards to some wrong people who are actually against us. They're giving some awards, they are celebrating them, they're giving them positions without checking them out. And that's pretty bad.
I can see a whole lot more to go, but I'm afraid we're totally out of time. So thank you for sharing this with us and for making the time to talk to us. And that's it from us this week. Thank you for watching this show. We'll see you again same time next week.